All great marriages begin and end with death. Now, that may sound grim, but it's a good thing. Trust me. It's fine, guys. This is fine. It's easy to avoid things that sound difficult and don't provide immediate pleasure. With all our comforts, why take up a burden that can interfere with your day-to-day joy? Yet, if you don't voluntarily take on burdens, life tends to get much worse. When it comes to happiness in marriage, practical concerns are the most obvious. Relationship influencers will tell you picking the right partner is the biggest factor, as if you could ever know who that would be. You're constantly changing, and having someone who changes with you is important. Someone who's easy to get along with, someone who you can work with, those are things that matter, but how could you ever know who that is heading into a marriage? It's luck. It's really just luck when it comes to all the practical stuff. But that's why I want to talk about a letter JRR Tolkien wrote. It's titled Letter Number 43. It's to his son, who is considering marriage while he's off in World War II, to, I believe it's a nurse that's helping out his infantry. And so Tolkien, as a father, is trying to impart his wisdom onto his son as he considers going on this adventure. And the big thing Tolkien tells us is that the spiritual considerations are the things you can control, right? I just mentioned most of the practical things are luck, but the spiritual things, these are more in our hands than just random circumstance. The letter is really honest, like brutally honest, more honest than you'd expect from a writer of fairy tales, and that's why I think it's so interesting. You know, you'll see a lot of influencers online more in the manosphere, somebody like an Andrew Tate, and he'll give you premises like men are driven to be polygamous, to have multiple relationships. And Tolkien actually goes, yes, that's true. But Tolkien just has much different answers than an Andrew Tate would provide. You know, Tolkien believes that men are lustful, but men do have the choice to not be overtaken by that lust. You know, you're an animal, you have this biological drive, and Tolkien completely acknowledges that. But there is a choice to, essentially what the Christian perspective would be, to run from lust, to avoid it, to not engage with it in any way. Outside of that, Tolkien gives two other perspectives that can be important for men dealing with women. One would be that friendship is not really possible, that we live in a fallen world, and that men and women can't truly be friends except maybe in old age, maybe if they're saints. But temptation will creep in on one side or another. So he's warning his son against that urge. Another would be to not use a woman as a muse, as some type of guiding star to over elevate them into some form of inspiration. Carl Jung has a great quote on this too, that, you know, where he speaks of seeing the potential in the other person, that being the initial infatuation that you have, that idealized version that people always often see at the beginning of relationships, that is showing you what the relationship could become. So Tolkien is warning against that in a different way, essentially saying we live in a fallen world. Since the fall of man, of Adam and Eve, you can't say a woman is your guiding star. They're just as fallen as you are. Tolkien's also critical of romantic love. This is very interesting because he grows up in the Gothic tradition. So he's thinking a lot about chivalry. In his youth, he had many thoughts around it as well, about being in love with somebody as sort of an idealized virtue that's somewhat separate from matrimony. That's why he's kind of warning us against it. And he's saying that idealized version is not possible. There are practical concerns such as age and childbearing that the more spiritual romantic love tends to grow out of. They're not separate entities. You know, it's not the platonic ideal of love is not separate from the on the ground necessary reality. The dark part of what Tolkien's saying is that, I mentioned it a little bit before, but men are not naturally monogamous. He would say women are naturally monogamous, and that is the correct thing to be. But for men, it's a revealed ethic. And so on monogamy, Tolkien says, men just ain't, not by their animal nature. monogamy, although it has been fundamental to our inherited ideas, is for us men a piece of revealed ethic, according to faith and not to flesh. He goes on and says that there's a great mortification that must happen in marriage, and it's essentially self-denial, the denial of your lustful, sexually seeking self. You might be familiar with the comedian Patrice O'Neal, and he has a similar perspective on this, where he says men get married to prove their maturity to themselves. It's not so much about this romantic ideal of love, but they go, I'm old enough, I'm established, and I don't need to just be chasing out here. I don't need to give into those biological urges. I am mature enough to be in a monogamous relationship. So Patrice is somewhat hitting on that, but Tolkien is actually saying there's spiritual work that's extra, that's beyond just the seeking maturity. It's actually seeking eternal life, and we'll get a little bit more into that. And then on the self-denial, men can easily confuse themselves. They can think, oh, well, this romantic feeling I had at the beginning, all of a sudden it's starting to take a lot more work. Maybe I just haven't found my soulmate. But Tolkien warns his son and us that the soulmate is the one you're with, that you can always see the next person as having, oh, they're actually better at this, they're actually better at that. But truly, it takes work in any relationship. So you'll see people be serial monogamous and jump from one relationship to another, like, oh, this is the soulmate, they have this little flaw, so this is the soulmate, and keep on going down the line. And Tolkien is warning against that impulse. Tolkien himself even has an interesting love story. So when he is 18 years old, he's doing his studies, he's not doing so well, he's going to Oxford, and he's under the guardianship. I don't know the exact story, but it's not like a stepfather, it's a guardian separate from his parents, and he has an obligation to that person. So that person basically says, you have to stop seeing this woman who would eventually become his wife that you're in love with. So Tolkien stops, cuts off all communication, but then when he's 21 and he's graduating, he goes back to her. I believe she has a fiance. She's already found somebody else, but she dumps the fiance and she marries Tolkien. Another thing Tolkien brings up in this entire letter is that, men can be the more romantic sex, even though women tend to say darling more and speak in romantic language more, as he puts it. Men can more often have this idealized version where women are truly into the practical concerns of being in relationships. And it makes sense, right? They have a stricter biological clock than men do. So that story of Tolkien reminds me of another story with Soren Kierkegaard, where he's obviously high up in his head. He has all these different ideals. He's thinking about Abraham and Isaac and how Abraham has to give up his son in order to receive his son. And he somewhat applies that story to the woman he loves. And he doesn't marry her, but in his mind he's like, she's just not going to marry anybody. I'm giving her up to receive her again. But she's like, nope. And she goes, marries somebody else and lives a whole life with them. So that's a great case of the man being way too romantic, way high up in this idealized world, and the woman dealing with the more practical concerns. Tolkien ends his letter on the core message that gives us to what is the purpose of marriage in short, right? It's this self-denial, this self-death that leads to a renewal of life. And Tolkien puts it very eloquently. Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth, and more than that, death. By the divine paradox, that which ends life and demands surrender of all, and yet by the taste or foretaste of which alone can you seek in your earthly relationships, love, faithfulness, joy, be maintained, or take on that complexion of reality, of eternal endurance, which every man's heart desires. So this is the deep part. I mean, we're talking here about you can't ignore those practical concerns, they matter, but Tolkien is giving us a much higher spiritual concern that we can action on, that we can work on. that makes those practical concerns less significant, and to take you through the full Christian mindset on this. Only through Christ will we find eternal life, and that's true in a marriage. The source of everything you seek is there, including true love. You must die yourself in order to truly live with another. That's the divine paradox. The Eucharist is the pattern in that marriage. There you learn the hard secret, that love lives by self-sacrifice. When you die to yourself for your wife, your romance gains honor, fidelity, and the staying power that you yearn for. In a lot of ways, that conscious choice that you have to make to deny yourself, to die within yourself, and be reborn in the relationship, it is a lot more romantic than that infatuation you might initially feel. All right, thanks so much.